The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. The Nanaimo Systems Planning Organization exists to provide research, data analysis, and coordinated action related to the city's homelessness response. Known as the SPO for short, it began operations in April 2023. On the previous episode of this program, I spoke with Executive Director John McCormick, Board Chair Don Bonner, and Research and Mobilization Lead Andrew Thornton. Thornton said during that conversation that data suggests an average of 29 people are newly accessing services for those experiencing homelessness every month in Nanaimo. He also suggested that there are around 1,000 people believed to be experiencing homelessness in the community. Today, we bring you part 2 of that conversation. The next voice you hear will be Andrew Thornton.
What it's also going to take is not just data, but a different approach to a change in attitude to what data we use and how we use it. And I'm not advocating for Big Brother 1984 type of stuff, but I'll give you an example. They did in California, which is actually at the cutting edge of a lot of this thinking and research. They did a predictive study where they took 800 people and they got permission to use all of their kind of data that they have: Social Security, corrections and police, health, education, social assistance, and they did a predictive model with them. And they picked these people out and said, and what they did is they used AI to analyze these 800 people's data and begin to create interventions that would prevent them from becoming, they weren't homeless yet, but by developing this matrix and applying it to these 800 people, they were able to keep, I think it was like 750 out of 800 housed, or something like that. So the point of that is there isn't a magic formula like that TikTok or Meta is going to let us use, but we do need to change like how we think about data and what we do with it. Because in Canada, if you said you were going to use somebody's social insurance number to track what's happening with them, people would go absolutely ballistic and say, no way, it's an infringement of people's rights. You can't do this. And it's, again, I'm not advocating for Big Brother. I'm the least Big Brother-y type you'll ever run into. But we do need to change how we approach using data and what we think we can do with it, especially around getting some sort of predictive ability about who's going to become unhoused. Because the number one indicator of future homelessness is previous homelessness. And that is established in the research to a very, very high degree. There's no doubt about it. And in particular, in Canada, one of the things that a lot of research is done by people who are on the ground and who are doing high-level policy stuff is with youth. Because if we need to prevent young people from becoming unhoused, because if they become unhoused when they're young, they will be unhoused again and again and again, or for very, very long periods of time. So there's a group that's run out of the Canadian Observatory of Homelessness called Making the Shift, and their focus is entirely on youth homelessness and housing issues.
I'm wondering if you could give me maybe some local Nanaimo perspective on the idea that we can talk about using something like an AI model to predict who might become unhoused. But on some wider level, a lot of these issues might boil down to just affordability, and many of the things people might associate with visible homelessness are more factors that sort of discriminate, like who will become homeless in a scenario where some people are bound to just because it's really hard to afford housing. Like, how do those ideas factor into discussions at the kind of Nanaimo local level?
I'll start, Andrew, and you kick in. Nanaimo's in a very unique situation. And maybe last time we talked, I mentioned the Harry and Meghan scenario when they got booted from Buckingham Palace. They came to Vancouver Island first, which is a tell. It's a big tell about how Vancouver Island is seen in a unique way in the world by people who have means, who have the capacity to move here. And we know that, that this is a destination location for people who can afford to buy their way into this community. And it is having a significant impact. I think, Don, you could probably speak to the some of the impacts that are happening as a result of the gentrification that's happening in Nanaimo. Nanaimo used to be 40 years ago. I talked to people like Barney Bentall, and he'd say, man, 40 years ago, we didn't want to come and play music in Nanaimo. Now they're thrilled to come and play music in Nanaimo because it's not nearly the kind of rough and tumble town it was, 4 or 5 decades ago. It has changed dramatically, and in the Canadian context, it's probably changed more dramatically than almost any other place in the country. And it's because of the nature of how it's seen at a world level, not just at a Canadian level. That makes it really tricky. So when ideas are put up that that we should be following on the Medicine Hat model, or we should be looking at other communities in Canada, how they've addressed homelessness, there's a lot of reasons why those are good ideas, but they may not have direct application in Nanaimo, just because in places like Medicine Hat, they're actually not growing as a community. They don't have a rapid gentrification, rapid population growth. They've got more land to develop on. There's just so many reasons why that is not really a relevant conversation to be had. There's something about the work that's being done at a sort of a global community level that is very important and valuable, but it's not necessarily going to be able to direct line itself to a place like Nanaimo. Nor can places like Switzerland be useful, because the jurisdictions are different between the Canadian context and a context in Finland or Switzerland or other communities in Europe. There's good ideas there that potentially can get brought to Nanaimo, but it's not, again, a direct line to a community like Nanaimo. Don, do you want to just add to that from a city's perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. It's pretty clear that Nanaimo, when we passed over the 100,000 citizen mark, just a couple of years ago, we stopped being a small town and became a city, a large city. And with that comes growing pains. And as John said, the changes that have taken place, I grew up in Nanaimo, and it's much different now than it was in the 60s and 70s. But with that said, an interesting thing that when I was on council, we were noticing for decades, there were no rental units being built in this city. And now the city is building roughly 1,600 a year, and it's not keeping up with the largest inflow of citizens that we've seen to Nanaimo ever. For a period of time there, and it may still be the case, Nanaimo was the 5th largest growing city in Canada. And that puts tremendous pressure on housing. And the province and the feds have not been able to keep up with this growth, with their policies and their funding. So that's where I think a lot of the problems coming is the pressure that is the lack of housing puts on rental units, and the very fact that we didn't have any rental units being built for decades, I think has created the situation we're having right now. And I remember just recently, I was just driving down the street, and I noticed somebody was on the corner, and they had 2 shopping carts, and they were looking at their computer. And I said, that person has just become homeless. They've just lost their stuff, and he's literally leaving, and he's got his computer, and he's answering his emails. And I said, we have a problem in our society when a person like that who falls through the cracks ends up homeless when there's nothing literally wrong with them other than they've lost their place to live. And we, unfortunately, have a very good system. When your house burns down, there's a whole bunch of resources that come to your aid and get you back up and running right away. When you lose your house, not by fire, but by income, we don't have those resources to save you, get you back up on your feet that we need in this situation. And I think the province and the feds really need to step up and start spending some valuable time and changing resources. And personally, I'm a big universal basic income person. I think that would solve a huge amount of our problems right off the bat. But that's probably a conversation for another time. And it's certainly not under our jurisdiction as the SPO does. So, although we could recommend it.
if you want to talk about affordability, the market system is never going to build affordable housing. It by definition, it will not build affordable housing. And what I always recommend is that people read, talk to, and watch all of the work of Carolyn Weitzman, who's currently at the University of Toronto School of Cities. And she has said, we cannot build our way out of this. Of course, we need to build more housing, but the question needs to be, what housing are we building where and for whom and at what cost? Not more housing. As Don said, there's never been more building in Nanaimo. It is completely, it's hard to believe that much housing is being built, but it's not affordable by any stretch of the imagination. And there's a whole discussion about that. But one of the things, just to point to Carolyn Weitzman, who's in one of her podcasts said, and actually the definitions of affordability, even in the federal government, there's 6 different definitions in different, depending on who you talk to. So first of all, affordability is a confused concept and is used as an out because it sounds, affordable sounds, what it does is it blames the individual. You can't create enough income to have an affordable house. That must be your problem. So really what we need, and again, Don is right, we can't do this, but we can recommend it. We need non-market housing built, and a lot of it and constantly for the next 20 to 30 years, if we're going to be anywhere approaching, dealing with the housing problems. Because housing is not just about housing, it's about everything that contributes to housing and being housed and being healthy. We don't have a housing problem as well. This is the way the market system is designed. It's designed to create profit and to create scarcity. So this is what we have. We have the housing market that the private market has brought to us. There is no housing crisis, strictly speaking. It's functioning exactly the way the free market system wants it to work. And I can go on about that. But you also did ask about specifically in Nanaimo. In Nanaimo, we know, for example, a very high percentage of Indigenous individuals are unhoused. We know that the age cohorts are fairly well understood. Still tends to be the highest percentage tends to be, between 35 and 55. The vast majority of unhoused would be in that cohort. One of the issues that's never been resolved, and it might seem a bit theoretical, is reporting on unhoused numbers for both women and Indigenous is a bit tricky. Number one, because people don't want to say that they're unhoused. And they often also, for women, they can't say that they're unhoused because if they do, they're legally not entitled to be in the charge of their children. It's actually MCFD will come and take your children if you are declared unhoused. So obviously, women aren't going to self-identify as unhoused freely. So those are 2 really kind of important issues. We also know there's a kind of good understanding of how youth homelessness happens. It tends to be around the things you would imagine, but in particular also for LGBTQ2IS and queer folks tend to get into conflict with parents, especially as they emerge out of puberty into adulthood. And that's a key driver, in fact, of homelessness in that sector. It's well understood, not just in Canada, but in the US and globally as a very serious issue. So we know that that root is there. We don't know exactly what the numbers might be in Nanaimo. Again, very hard to work with and find unhoused youth, in particular because if you're under the age of 18, it's very tricky to work with people. They can't give consent for certain things and other things. So those are the kind of things we do know, though, in particular around Indigenous homelessness, represent anywhere from 35 to 40% of the total unhoused population. And we also think that's probably kind of an underestimate, as all PIC count numbers are. Just wanted to kind of backfill that bit. Thanks.
I'll just add one additional piece. The fastest growing segment would be people over 45, age 45, seniors, and these are people who have been renters for decades, and or even have been homeowners, and as they move out of their income earning years, they just don't have enough to survive on, And so we're seeing an increase in people who are living in their cars, or, they buy an RV and then there's difficulties around that. As Don knows, there's a lot of issues around where you're going to park and where you're going to get access to services. This is really difficult. And these are people who, this is not sort of, self-induced in some way or the result of trauma. It's simply income-based. It's economic, and they just simply can't afford to live in their hometown anymore. And they've lived here for decades. So it's, this is a multifaceted challenge, as you're hearing, with many cohorts of community members outside of those who we sort of normally consider to be the stereotypical person who's homeless.
And that's that part about rent is really important. And wages, there's a number of studies. You can look at any different ones, but there's a really good one by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that's called the Minimum Wage Rent Study. And what they did was they looked at the average rents in cities across Canada, the average rents, and then they divided that by the minimum wage in that community to come up with a number that shows how many hours a week somebody on minimum wage would have to earn in order to pay rent, the average rent. And some of the places, they're in the area of 70, 80 hours per week. And of course, nobody can work 70 or 80. You can, but it's, it's obviously not really reasonable to do so. Or they did what the minimum wage would need to be in order to live in that place in the average rents. And it is in the neighborhood of $35, $32 an hour, $40 an hour, in order to afford the average, not even a high, but the average rent.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada and generous listeners like you. Support and grow our nonprofit newsroom project today at chly.ca/donate with a monthly or one-time donation. With your support, we can expand Midcoast Morning from 2 to 3 original programs per week to cover local news, current affairs, and arts and culture.
Today on the program, we're bringing you part 2 of a conversation on coordinating the community's response to homelessness. My guests are John McCormick, Andrew Thornton, and Don Bonner, who are with the Nanaimo Systems Planning Organization, or SPO for short. The organization exists to provide research and data and to coordinate the community's response to homelessness. It started operations in April 2023. The SPO is an independent, non-aligned agency governed by a 9-member board. According to the organization's charter, the city will provide core funding for the SPO for the initial 5 years of its operation. In 2026, an independent review of the SPO will be initiated and completed by a consultant hired by the city to look at the SPO's mandate, structure, funding, and performance. We're going to get you back to my conversation with Andrew Thornton, Don Bonner, and John McCormick of the SPO. A reminder, you can find the first part of our discussion online at chly.ca/midcoastmorning. So if it's fair, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if it's a fair takeaway from all of that, really to address Canada's housing needs, housing issue, it would take a couple of decades of just building a lot more non-market housing and providing that to people. Like, short of that, in the near term, in the next couple of years here in Nanaimo, what kind of actions, what are the things that the SPO is working on to take some kind of stab at making a change?
There is there are landowners who are interested, and they're in the form of community-owned landowners. So nonprofit societies that have land, churches, community centers, and a portion of them are quite interested, like a sizable portion, are quite interested in how they can participate in helping to address the housing crisis. And in many cases, certainly churches are a good example of this. You may have a diminishing congregation, and they're aging, and they tend to be organizations that have pretty good land holdings. The Brecon United Church situation in Nanaimo is a good example of this, where they took a aging congregation and a church that was in need of being rebuilt and turned it into 50 or more units of housing. I don't know the exact number, and an updated church. I mean, this is a very good model for how we can proceed. It can't obviously address all of the housing, but it can start moving us in the right direction. We know that the Department of Defense lands, D&D lands, are going to be redeveloped with some very large number of units on those lands that Nanaimo First Nation is going to be building. That's going to be helpful, really helpful, and we have a small role to play in that in a consulting capacity. So we can do these kinds of things to try and start moving us in the right direction, and then at the same time, as Don has said, give our local community elected officials, including our provincial and federal officials, the information they need to be able to operate in their spheres of influence to also not just speak for Nanaimo, but speak for for Nanaimo and all the other communities that are struggling with the same crisis that exists here in Nanaimo. So we're part of that network of system planning organizations, not only in Nanaimo, but on Vancouver Island, in the province and across the country, that are also raising the voice at a community-wide and a low provincial level and a national level about the need for more federal funding, more provincial funding to address this, and a change really to the way we think about housing. If housing is a right, then let's reflect it in policy terms. Let's not just use the language of housing as a right and then not actually do anything about it. It's irrelevant if you do that. It's simply a platitude.
Housing, visible poverty, I think it's fair to say that they consistently rank as the number one issue that municipal councillors, municipal governments here in Nanaimo at the very least seem to report on as, this is what I am hearing the most about from my constituents. This is the thing they most want us to address. Speaking to this issue on the radio, is there anything that you would want to communicate to people who might be concerned about the issue as a final thought on what's being done to address it?
I have one, and which I'm going to borrow from another conversation. And housing is, and it may or may not stick. Housing is about more than housing. It's just a one point, one intersecting aspect of a whole set of complex problems. Now, does that make it easier to solve? I think it does. It also makes it easier, not easier, but more develop more subtle analysis than simply we'll build more housing and we'll have solved all our problems. Housing is just our housing problems are a symptom of other problems, right? If we were already building, like Don said, 1,600 units a year, our problem isn't building housing. Our problem is what Carolyn Weitzman says, the type of housing we're building, who we're building it for, at what cost we're building it. Now, and that needs to be part and parcel of the change, is to say to people, housing and visible poverty are just two visible aspects, housing problems, two visible, highly visible aspects of much deeper problems, some of which the municipality cannot address on its own as a government. But Carolyn Weitzman is also very clear in her work that it needs to be all hands on deck, all four levels of government. And by four levels, I include Indigenous nations in that conversation. And they're very committed to it, and they're very switched on in the space. So it's not a matter of saying the feds have to do it, the province has to do it, the municipality has to do it, First Nations have to do it. Everyone has to be all hands on deck, and figuring out in particular, and I think the city is doing, and the province is working towards this, is how to work together collectively on these specific issues. Again, that might seem very abstract, but it's very concrete. Instead of just pointing fingers, we're working as a collective, and I think we're better than we were 10 or 15 years ago. I don't know if Don or John would agree, but we're still moving. We need to move more towards an agreement on what we're doing. Are we addressing affordability, or are we addressing poverty? Those are two different things, I would suggest. They're related, but if my focus was on poverty, my conversation is going to be very different from the conversations about affordability. Again, that's maybe a bit abstract, but maybe John or Don can make that more concrete.
Very well said. Don?
Well, the only thing I could add to that is addressing the root cause of homelessness and poverty is key. And until such time as the federal, provincial, and other levels of government started doing that, we will continue to be plugging dikes with our fingers and not actually dealing with the fact that the water is rising and it's going to start overflowing. So I think it's really important that at a municipal level, even for the people that are listening to this, is to understand who is responsible for what, and then to address your concerns to that level of government. Being on council, I can tell you right now, we got every complaint about everything under the sun. Didn't matter if we were responsible for it at all. And it boils down to this. The problems that people are seeing in our city are in their backyards or on the roads. And so they're going to complain to the organization that is responsible for that, which is the municipality. And I think it's incumbent on us as the SPO to help mold the data that allows us to the levels of government that are local, municipal, First Nations, to advocate to the other provinces and federal government to bring solutions to this. And we can only do so much at the municipal level. I think until such time as our society starts dealing with the root causes, we'll continue to be doing this for the next 30 years, long after I'm gone and don't need a house.
Don, John, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Don Bonner is chair of the board of the Nanaimo Systems Planning Organization, or SPO for short. John McCormick is the group's executive director, and Andrew Thornton is their research and mobilization lead. The SPO is an independent, non-aligned agency funded by the city. Its purpose is to coordinate the community's response to homelessness. That was part 2 of a conversation. You can find the first part on our website at chly.ca/midcoastmorning. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and RB Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom and more. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.